TED Talks. Who knows what a TED Talk is? Anyone? Yeah, good. We don't talk about TED. These are short, fast-paced, compelling, no pressure, perhaps controversial. So welcome to what I hope will be a really enjoyable, dynamic session. A little bit of an intro. Miners are understandably, I think, a conservative bunch. And when faced with change, particularly around something as boring as energy supply, they probably wish it would all just blow away. But that's not going to happen. And inexorable changes are in the wind for many, including me. It's an exciting time. But where is it all headed? Just recently in my role, I was very fortunate to be invited to an energy forum for mining held in Johannesburg by Anglo American. And at one point we discussed what the mine of the future might look like in terms of energy. When the conversation opened with a debate on small modular nuclear reactors at the bottom of platinum mines, after all, if they go off, they're a hell of a long way down, I knew we were in for an interesting ride. And it was amazing what came out of that discussion. So now it's our chance to ponder these things and cast our minds a few decades into the future. Oops. Just what will the mine of the future look like in terms of energy? Well, we're going to hear from 4 speakers who cover the spectrum of angles, I think, who have got 5 minutes to convince us that their vision is the right one. So speakers, 5 minutes only. I'm using an automatic mechanical watch, so there's a little bit of flexibility on time. And when you start, can I ask that you introduce yourself at the start, please? So I'm not going to do that. Audience, you get your chance to challenge these visions once we've heard from them all. So let's get started with our first speaker, Brad Valiukas. Please start by introducing yourself, Brad. And please stand up. Please stand up.
So hopefully this works if I speak into it. Excellent. So my name's Brad. I'm a mining engineer. I've got 20 years experience predominantly in the underground side of the industry, a little bit of open pit. Technical services manager for Northern Star. So I look after a number of things, mining, but a bunch of power projects as well. And I've done a couple of chief operating officer roles, so fairly good feel for where the industry is overall and the balance between corporate and costs and finance and operations. Anyway, thank you for the opportunity to present. Northern Star is an underground mining company. I'm an underground miner, so I will be focused on talking about underground for the mine of the future, and I think that's where it's at anyway. We run projects on diesel, we run projects on gas off the pipeline, we run projects connected to the grid. But we also now have a project where we have diesel and the grid integrated together. Right at the start, I want to put a couple of numbers out there for context because I think it's really important to all the discussions here today. We're talking about energy as a be-all and end-all, and I'd maybe like you to take away at the end of this little 5 minutes that maybe that's not the case. So for underground mining, the amount of electricity we put into the ground to run ventilation fans, jumbos, long hole drills, everything like that, pumps, is about 3 to 5% of our cost base. The amount of diesel we put down into mobile equipment is about 5%, and of course our other big energy input is explosives, be somewhere around 3%. Obviously all of these numbers vary depending on the mine and the circumstances and the depth and whether you're running cooling and all those sort of things, but as rough numbers, I don't think they're too bad. Open pit, you're talking about 10% maybe for diesel, 7% for explosives. Processing, you're talking about up to 15%, well, probably at least 15%, 20% for your total power cost, depending on the size of the plant. So we need our energy to be reliable, flexible, secure, and it needs to be cost effective. And when we talk about load shedding, etc., please keep in mind that sometimes if you could save 10% of our energy cost, but we lost 1% production, we'd be going backwards. So that's where we're focused. Environmental is nice, but I think the proof's in the pudding. We have a number of large solar installations that resource companies have picked up in WA. You could count on one finger, so it's not much. Let's see. Righto, mine of the future, underground. Already in WA, Already in Australia, more than 50% of the gold we produce comes from underground mining. We're a long way from the 80s oxide open pits, and that's going to continue, and principally because you walk around on the surface and probably everything that we can find that's significant has been found, and certainly the probability of finding it, if it's not, is decreasing every year. Sorry, refer to my notes. So if we're going underground, what are the levers we can pull? So we hear a lot of talk about big data. Fundamentally though, we drill, we blast, we fire, we bog, we haul, we crush, we grind. And it doesn't really affect that too much. It's a nice to have. We talk about batteries for underground mining. Fantastic. And I really look forward to the day when it's pervasive. But fundamentally, we do exactly the same thing. The only thing we've changed is the power pack. So if we want to change the mine in the future, where are we going? We're going to automation. And with automation, we see that we can drop 20% at least off our cost base for our operations. That lets us mine deeper, it lets us mine lower grade ore, it lets us mine more. It puts us back on a playing field with Southeast Asia and Africa in terms of what we can do. Northern Star, last week we conducted, we think, world first, 4G LTE trial underground in one of our mines at Kalgoorlie. Why did we do that? Because we don't think we can get what we need from Wi-Fi. So we've said we've got to go to that next level of technology, that's 4G. We're down that path. So, you know, we had some pretty good visitors on that day at Sandvik and Atlas Copco, two of the largest OEMs for underground mining equipment. BHP came and joined us for the trial. It was a pretty good day, and it was all successful. So realistically, that is what's going to change what we do from a mining point of view underground. It changes the way we set out a mine from the start. What do we need? We still need the same things for our power. Still reliable, flexible, secure, safe. More and more as we go forward, we need to be environmentally responsible, and there'll be more and more focus on that, undoubtedly. But fundamentally, we need the same things. And it doesn't have to be an all or nothing where we change from diesel to or gas or grid to solar. Right? Well, I think we can do this very progressively, and I think that's the story for the next 20 years, is how we do it progressively and how we incorporate it gradually and piecemeal, and hopefully in 20 years we're looking at this full integrated site. I think we're going to hybrid. I don't really subscribe to the forecasts of diesel price rise because there's an absolute plethora of infrastructure installed all over the world designed to get diesel to us. And the better solar is, it's going to force that through. We don't want to be on diesel, but undoubtedly, or gas, preferably, like we get rid of both. But undoubtedly, there's always going to be a time when that ability to feed in and either supplement a battery or to top up at 3 a.m. in the morning when your production's looking there, we're going to want to be able to do that. 30 seconds. Okay. Batteries underground will come and they will be, I think, dominant in the next few years. But at the same time, as we go to automation, it changes that perspective a little bit as well. So, you start talking about trolley lines in the backs of declines and different ways to haul. We've already gone to smaller trucks at steeper gradients. At Northern Star, we've customised trucks to achieve that. We've gone away from the bigger is better. It's the first step in terms of, smaller, faster, automated battery. We've taken that step even now just on diesel. Automation is agnostic. You get back to dedicated shaft haulage and things like that when you can go to complete automation and nobody there, little 2 metre diameter shafts. So we will go battery. Battery will be dominant. I don't think it'll be everything. There's some really good hybrid technology coming in. If it can get us 90% of the way, that's an awesome step. We can't wait until we get 100% of the way. We've got to go. All up, underground, we're going to take twice as much electricity as we do at the moment. If you look at the fact that we're going to drop our cost base, you see electricity becoming, greater than 10% of a cost base. Massive change from 3% becomes a critical input rather than an enabling input, and that will change the way we go about it. And there's plenty of things, I think, for panel discussion.
Okay. Thanks, Brad. Anyone in the room challenged? I think think I used the term conservative. I think I really meant pragmatic. So let's go to our next speaker, Michael Pitt.
Morning everyone. Like Paul said, Michael Pitt from New Century Resources. And I'd like to start by quoting one of our panel members from yesterday who I thought summed up how we should think about these things really well when he said that over a 2-year time frame we tend to overestimate and over a 10-year time frame we tend to underestimate. So I'd like to break my comments into those two buckets, and I've introduced the Mines of the Future portion of the commentary by just describing a little bit of what we do at New Century Resources, which we're terming economic rehabilitation. So we're not a traditional mining company. Not on? Sorry about that, I hope you heard most of it. So we're not a traditional mining company where we're out there exploring, dropping holes in the ground and trying to find a greenfield site. We're taking on tailings deposits from big miners who have decided that the mine has come to the end of its economic life. We're predominantly metallurgists who see value in the tailings that are still there and think that we can process those and make a profit. At the same time, we're rehabilitating the site. As you can imagine, that rehabilitation aspect brings with it the environmental aspects. So having a cleaner source of energy for us is quite important as well because it fits with our corporate motto and helps with your approach to government, which was mentioned yesterday at the start of the day. So with that introduction, I'll go back to the long-term view, and Paul stole a bit of my thunder where, as an engineer, and this is something that a view that I've held since I was a teenager, then going through university, I thought nuclear was the best way to power the world. The small modular reactors, to me, seem like the logical place where we end up in, be it 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. If we're putting large solar plants into the field in 50 years' time, I'd be staggered. I think it's something that has its place now, but it's just not going to be the way to go in future. One of the biggest rehabilitation items that we have is trying to minimise the footprint of disturbance. The site that we're developing at the moment is going to need 35 megawatts of power. It's just not reasonable to go out there, raise however many hectares of land and put in solar panels. So that's the long term, and I think humans will get there. You give them a challenge and put enough money into it, it's going to get there. There's studies going on in Canada in particular about how SMR reactors can be deployed into remote mines. In the short term, which is for small cap miners, far more important to me than worrying about what's going to happen in 50 years, I can see a large place for solar and batteries. And in particular, I think there's been a few comments over yesterday and then this morning again that sums up my thoughts perfectly, which is batteries are going to be the game changer. We can use solar to provide some of our power, but batteries are going to be what allows that power to be spread over our load, because ultimately what it always comes back to when talking to renewable companies is, what do I do for my power over a 24/7 period? And it's how do I spread that clean source of energy across that entire 24-hour period. So short term, I think it's technologies like solar, batteries, and the batteries are going to, over the next 3 to 5 years, become even more prominent, and then it's demand-side management. Those three things, to me, are the ideal mix for the power for our needs for the next 3 to 5 years. Take it out further, and I think things like nuclear are going to come right into the mix, where we can go to site and have a very, very small footprint of disturbance to provide all of our power needs. You can have 2, 3, 4 years worth of fuel put into it in its first load, and we'll work out the safety issues. And as an engineer in Australia, I'd love to see us taking nuclear waste. So that takes out the NIMBY factor, it takes out the corporate governance problems with shareholders who are worried about whether nuclear is actually considered clean. Personally, I think it's a beautiful source of power, and that's where I hope we eventually get to. Thank you.
Nothing controversial here. Let's go to our next speaker, who is Ned. Sorry, Ned, you're slightly out of order there.
Out of order.
That's fine.
So I put together a 64-page slide deck. Could we get that put up, please? And I don't know how to change the slides, but I assume it's this thing. So I have the greatest job in the world. I work at a nonprofit based in Colorado that has been working for 35 years on energy transitions. We recently merged with a nonprofit started by Richard Branson called the Carbon War Room. We're now Rocky Mountain Institute, but have a Carbon War Room heritage. So in some ways, I've got two bosses. One is a theoretical physicist who has been thinking and talking about energy and working with mining companies and other industries for 35 years. And I work for probably the most recognized entrepreneur in the world, both of whom look at energy transition from two different perspectives. And I'll try to share those today. I also am lucky enough to have 5 programs that work in the most complicated industries in the world when it comes to energy transition. I have a shipping program, global maritime shipping, cargo and bulk, aviation, long-haul trucking, methane emissions from the oil and gas industry, and we work with mining industries. So I'm literally at the coalface of the energy transition, which is a very different place than the ivory tower in Colorado. And today I'm going to talk about 3 things. 1, frogs, 2, Pac-Men, and 3, the mining industry. So when we think about energy transition today, I like to talk about being frogs in a pot. And in my world, when people talk about frogs in a pot, they're usually talking about climate change. But in this case, we are in the middle of an energy transition, and many of us aren't even aware of it. There's a convergence right now going on between new energy technologies that are revolutionary, between new customer behaviors that are driving energy efficiency and lower demand, and lastly, the convergence of electricity and mobility are game-changing. And most people aren't seeing these trends coming around. And in fact, if you look at who's participating in this world of energy now, customers are far more active than they ever were. Industry is far more active than it ever was. Cities and regions are driving the change. So you're seeing people acting in the energy world that have never acted in the energy world before. It used to be something the central government provided to you or utilities provided to you, and that is changing rapidly. Whether you're an individual who's putting solar in their house or you're a company who is essentially removing its load from the grid because it can do it cheaper and more reliably. And that's happening worldwide. Now, the mining industry is in a very unique position because obviously it has to oftentimes be its own utility. So the Pac-Man idea I want to talk about is a metaphor we created when we were talking about the electric utility. And there are what we call the 4 Pac-Men of the apocalypse that are coming after traditional energy business models. And these are, we believe, major trends that should drive the scenarios that every mining company is thinking about. Essentially, end-use efficiency, being more efficient, is dramatically reducing load around the world. Therefore, the load growth that drove the energy systems of the past is not there. You don't have infinitely growing energy demand to build your infrastructure in. Distributed and decentralized energy systems are winning the economic game. We aren't seeing it yet in mining, but I think it's coming. Demand flexibility, the ability now to actually think about the demand side to help meet your needs as well as the supply side is revolutionary. You can now, in most places, change load, shift load very dynamically, and this idea of base load is disappearing rapidly. The idea of spinning reserves are disappearing rapidly. So think about how that might affect your industry. And then lastly, and we talked about it a lot yesterday, your customer is going to care about energy. The homeowners are changing their energy use. Industries are changing their energy use. China is going to say we need to be lower carbon. They've committed to peaking by 2030. The major cities in China are going to peak by 2025. They're not going to accept carbon-intensive industries in their economy, which is going to push it all the way down to you guys. Louis mentioned yesterday, Amazon is deploying a radical supply chain transparency initiative this year, which is going to repeat something Walmart tried, which is to look deep into their supply chain and be able to track everything that goes on that website. in terms of its carbon intensity and energy intensity. How that plays out, nobody knows. So what does this mean for the mining industry? I won't run through all these things, but it's a convergence of mobility and electricity and a convergence of you within the supply chain that's going to change the game. Automation. There is no way an industry can have waste in its world in this growing supply chain. There's going to be load flexibility. The mines are going to rethink the way that they operate. They're going to be willing to shift load around, as we saw from Sun Resource. Was that what it was yesterday? That's going to be the norm. As you electrify your fleet of haulers and your equipment, you're going to be able to move electricity around in a dynamic way that's unimaginable right now. I think Honeywell is talking about the very beginning, but that is going to be a capacity. What Honeywell was talking about is going to be a capacity built into every single mining company in the world. Transparency. There is not going to be any hiding behind your internal firewalls. If you don't let the world know what your carbon intensity is or your energy intensity is, somebody will figure it out for you, given data out there. And lastly, this is really important. It isn't necessarily a topic of today, but the integration into the community. Your role as an energy supplier to the community around you and the countries you're operating in is going to be a major factor for the right to operate. For the mining industry, for the oil and gas industry, for the shipping industry, for the trucking industry, for the aviation industry. So you're not alone. And so going back to the convergence, there's going to be convergence of opportunity around all these industries. So that would be my view for the future. We can talk about nuclear later. So I'll pass it on. Is that your closing comments?
Maybe you can hang on to that. And we will talk about nuclear later. Okay, our last speaker is Ameren Roth Deblin. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Fantastic.
Okay, so can you introduce yourself? 5 minutes.
My name is Amiram. I come from a global renewable energy company, UV. We are the ones that have developed, built, and now do the O&M for the De Grasser hybrid project, PV hybrid project. And why am I here today? I can't believe it myself. I'm in front of mining experts, CEOs in that space, financiers, and you all have a need. And that is address your energy requirements, and you're seriously looking today at renewable energy. That's a sea change. More than 20 years ago, as you can hear, I'm from Germany. I used to work in the automotive industry. People were joking about solar to power entire industries. Ridiculous. Renewable energy, the price, unbelievably high. This will never ever, and this is including my professors and apart from people like Amory Lovins, you were laughed at. And again, here today, I'm standing in front of people who care about cash costs, valuation of companies, their operational security, and you all think about renewable energies. So what I see, and what I'm going to say next, will hardly come as a surprise to you. The power will be renewable. At what speed and in what shape or form depends a lot about your individual operations. Are you underground? Is it an open pit mine? Are you grid connected? Are you off grid? But it's definitely going to be, as my previous speaker said, it's going to be automated and it's going to be electric. And in my opinion, it will be powered by renewable energy. In greater detail, what are the benefits of renewable energy? We talk a lot about risks, and actually renewables will reduce the risk, will reduce financing costs for companies and increase valuations because banks will attach a lower risk premium to a mining operation that is deploying renewables. Therefore, your valuation goes up. You've got more money to reinvest in new exploration, in operational improvements. So I think the risk perspective is going to change. And I think there's already, the mine of the future is already being built today and driven by, champions within companies, within boards levels that not only think about the energy transition, but take steps to carefully plan, deploy, and make use of solar, wind, and of course battery technologies. So the mine of the future underground, and I hear more than I actually expected, is going to operate with electric vehicles, drills. I don't think we blast everything open with, definitely not with nuclear, but certainly also not with solar power. And so again, and I want to keep that fairly short, the major driver behind all we are doing, this massive machinery, hauling, crushing, and refining a lot of ore, is the people behind it and the people driving it, and making a decision today to not wait for others or wait for tomorrow to power your mine in a different way, but think about it now, and then the companies that are taking the right steps today are likely, and well, in my opinion, are very likely to be the mining champions of the future. And Sandfire is for me one example. I've been very impressed by Sunmetal's approach. I knew they were doing a large-scale grid-connected system, but ramping down or processing plant in order to benefit from an additional and new income stream. I think these are the models of the future. So yeah, as a closing remark, and I'm probably even shorter than 5 minutes.
Keep going.
Okay. Okay. I think it's the first presentation where I undercut my time. In my opinion, it's definitely renewable. Solar will be a big part, wind, and maybe, since I have more time than I expected, talking a bit about operational experience. We see the Sandfire DeGrasser mine in operation right now, and I just heard from Honeywell that they, of course, see the SCADA in the cloud. I fully concur with that. And we see, and we've developed, because we couldn't find a product on the market actually that monitors the system on a second-by-second basis, a SCADA system, custom-made for a hybrid system. We are a project developer and EPC and operator, but we couldn't find anything on the market. And then, of course, we have engineers in-house and came up with a SCADA system that anyone who is interested to see how that project is running, as I speak here, we have a screen over there. We can live dial into the system and see what is the spinning reserve at this point in time with diesel gensets. What is the battery doing? What's the solar penetration or contribution? And that's happening today. The mine is running, and in our opinion, and I think the mine operators and the electrical superintendent confirmed this Tuesday on a site visit that they're very happy with the system. There are no outage problems. And again, the mine of the future is one with lower cash costs, a higher valuation, and which has renewable energy at the core of its strategy and operational operations. Thank you very much with that.
And thanks to all our TED talkies. Look, one thing I should have said at the start is that we value all opinions. So certainly respect the opinion of every talker today. Everyone has opinion in this. The future is hard to get right, okay? And if there's one thing I know is that all of those estimates will probably be wrong. So it's going to be some mix, who knows. So here we start a bit of an interactive dialogue with you, the audience. To do that, I'll be asking for questions. Just hold back on that, but certainly get your questions in order. If you put your hand up and I point to you, please, we'll get a microphone to you. Please state your affiliation and name and ask the question. But I'm going to start by introducing a fifth panellist, Nathan Flamen, yep, from BHP, and you can introduce yourself in a second. But I just want to start the discussion by, we heard a fair bit in there about the importance in the future of social issues, community, and the mining community stakeholders. How important is that to BHP? So start by introducing yourself and then perhaps some thoughts on that.
Nathan Flamen, and I'm currently practice lead with BHP looking at electricity supply project involved for about 3 months, how to meet our needs in the long term. So it's a special project that I've been involved with for about 3 months. When we think about community and the endorsement and support that's required there, it's of utmost importance. And I think that this is a currently increasingly challenging issue as we see income disparity rising globally and many people feeling disenfranchised. brand value being a more important issue than it has been in the past. And I think corporates have a need to reestablish that link with local communities and the environment. I think that energy can play an interesting role here. So if we look at how we supply power to our sites, the opportunities that may exist here to build on our community engagement and relationships with those communities as part of that procurement process. I think that there's a huge opportunity to some of the communities that we operate in, like Roxby Downs, Newman Township. I think there's opportunities at some of these where we're currently supplying, for example, at Newman, supplying power from our gas-fired generating station to look at opportunities for potentially supporting solar in that town.
Yeah, so I think the reason I mentioned it last, obviously the right to operate is key for a lot of bigger industries. And the issues around climate, the issues around local air pollution, the issues around community shared value are increasing dramatically. And one of the driving factors of renewables is in the long run, it doesn't take a huge EPC company to solve the problem. It's a simple product that can be modularized and installed quickly. We heard SunShift yesterday. Their approach, 5B, is doing a demonstration right after this panel in which they have a model where you can basically deploy the actual manufacturing into the community. So if you're in the United States and you're going to work on legacy sites, which is some work we're doing with the various firms, you can actually deploy a solar manufacturing firm right in that community that can service all the mines around it, do the same thing in sub-Saharan Africa. And so now you're not only improving your own power supply and security, you're creating jobs, you're giving the local economy an entrepreneurial opportunity. And that is a game changer when it comes to the right to develop new assets wherever you are. So critically important.
Actually, Ned, the Anglo-American function I took part in was actually in Africa, and that is a very big deal for them because they have such an impact on the communities they work within, particularly around health, education, etc. Not such an issue in Australia, but certainly an issue in some parts of the world.
And I did promise myself I would bring circus into this somehow. So if they can set up a circus in 5 days and keep it safe and not kill people, you should be able to set up a solar system in 5 days anywhere in the world and have it connected to the grid safely, securely. And that's, I think, what a lot of people don't understand. It's not going to take the kinds of firms it requires to build energy systems in the future.
Michael and Brad, from you're much closer to the gritty end of this spectrum. One of the key stakeholders for you, I'm sure, is shareholders. What do you think the influence of shareholders in your energy mix is going to be? Either one.
Look, I think the shareholders are always interested. We have people, like all company shareholders, are in and out. I think everybody, we're probably more concerned about the community than the shareholders directly in that. So we are working, and I'm sorry if it sounded negative before when I mentioned hybrid, etc. But from our point of view, we've internally all but committed to putting our first solar installation into Kalgoorlie to offset our diesel use. So in that community, that will be well regarded. That will be excellent for us. It should be excellent for the community, and it should make sense both financially and socially.
Yeah, and for us, I was mentioning earlier that it fits perfectly with our reason for being. We're a rehabilitation company. We've taken over someone else's legacy site. We believe we can operate that profitably while we're cleaning up the site. So in terms of the messaging that we take to our current shareholders and future shareholders, being able to add into the mix that our energy sourcing is green is a very important part of that, and our energy demand within our OPEX is actually far higher than the numbers you were mentioning earlier. Ours is going to be more in the order of 30 to 40% of our OPEX, so it's a vitally important one for us in terms of achieving the profitability. We're going to be dictated by economics. So to offset they're dictated by economics. So to offset the diesel that's currently being burnt on site, the economics stack up, no worries. We are grid connected, so it's a slightly harder job to work out how large that penetration can be, but we're going to be including that as a pretty key portion of the feasibility study for the overall restart of the mine. So it's a key component for us.
Okay, so you've given me a lovely segue into nuclear. You talk about rehabilitation and cost, and I'm sure there are people in the room that would challenge you on both that. And I'm not trying to be controversial or confrontational, and for the purposes of disclosure, my own company builds nuclear power stations. So what's the panel's opinion of some of these out there ideas? Nuclear, I think, is one of them. There's others, hydrogen, for example. Who'd like to start?
I'm happy to comment on nuclear. So I've been involved in nuclear for about 13 years. I started my career with Cameco in Canada, uranium miner. And we looked quite closely at potentially putting up an SMR at one of our mine sites in Saskatchewan then. I looked at a lot of different technologies, couldn't make it work. And for the past 4 years, I've sat with our marketing team in Singapore looking at the global future for all forms of energy. As BHP is a producer of many different forms of energy, we like to look at the holistic energy mix and think about how this will evolve to 2050 and beyond. So we think quite deeply about these things. And I think we can take a fairly objective view as a uranium producer from Olympic Dam, but also producer of other forms of energy. And I'd say that nuclear is really struggling right now. The opportunity to potentially assist people that follow the industry. I think SMRs are an interesting opportunity to potentially see a step change in the technology. The problem with these very large reactors is they're very expensive, and unlike the technologies that we've been talking about here for the last 2 days, which costs keep coming down, their costs keep rising, which is an issue. If there's a step change, if we do see SMRs come through, I think the big challenge there again is that what drove cost declines here is the mass production of the units. The first SMR will be very expensive. The industry needs to decide on which is the technology that will win. A supply chain needs to evolve to support that technology. Then you need to begin to roll out many of these things in a uniform fashion to get the cost down. The opportunity to improve what the nuclear industry has done is every time a reactor is constructed, it finds opportunities to improve on that in the next one. So very few of them are actually the same, which again keeps costs up. And of course, you run into the fact that you need a regulatory regime to support it, which we don't have in Australia. So it's easier to deploy reactors in a country that already has them. It'll be much more challenging here. And then ultimately the community issues, which despite the fact-based arguments for nuclear, you will always run into significant community hurdles.
Yeah, particular issue here in Australia, definitely. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think two things. One, the economics are just wrong. I mean, the economics of other technologies have exponential drops in their cost curve. There's no theoretical way you can get to exponential drops in the cost in SMRs, at least that we've seen. There might be some new technology that comes online, but as far as we know, there's nothing close to commercialization. And then secondly, we can't forget the national security issues. Europe and the United States is not going to be, they're just not going to let dirty bombs be deployed all over the world to be picked up by terrorists or whatever. So the issues of proliferation become an issue with nuclear and who can model what that's going to look like. So we just don't see it competing with other technologies.
I probably should try and back up what I was saying earlier, seeing as I decided to bring it up.
Not at all.
So the context was definitely about the power supply of the future. In the initial contact we had about doing this 5-minute TED Talk, I was talking about 20 to 25 years. In terms of trying to forecast what those prices are for technologies, no one on Earth can even take a wild stab at it. So in that context, it's similar to sitting there 20 years ago and trying to decide whether solar was going to get to where it's going to get to. The social aspect, absolutely. It's a really tough sell. I remember back at university, we had 2 professors going at it with a debate as to whether or not the waste can be safely stored in Australia. I thought the case for that was rather strong. And from an engineering standpoint, there's no reason why it can't be done. The fact that we continue to mine uranium, the fact that we continue to allow exploration, says to me that long term, it's still potentially has a role to play. It's definitely got large hurdles, but I wouldn't be ruling it out at this point, and it has such large advantages over other forms that when we, you know, there's a lot of pipe dreams out there that the next generation's going to be better. We're going to get thorium reactors. All these things are potential in the future. And I'd hate for us to close our minds off to that potential, because it's ultimately it's a very clean source of lots of energy.
Yep, and maybe a moral imperative to take the waste back. Who knows? Not going to start that debate.
And a great business.
Perhaps. I mentioned hydrogen. Our company's just done a study for the South Australian government about to come out. I've always been a cynic of the hydrogen route. You know, some people call it a breaking, you know, one law of thermodynamics, or a crime against thermodynamics, given the efficiencies. But I have to say, the outcome from the study was very surprising. What do people think of hydrogen?
Yeah, certainly. I think the energy mix of the future will see solar in particular and wind providing the least cost energy option. And then the question is, how do you fill the gap between that? And storage is a very big topic. And I think batteries are very hyped right now and will play a crucial and disruptive and revolutionary role. But technologies like power to gas and hydrogen is one solution in that. And where I come from in Germany, we have a huge gas grid in which probably you can't store hydrogen very properly, but methane, for example. Yeah, so anything that stores energy and then has a decent conversion efficiency and a price curve that matches will be important in the future, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I would say from our perspective, the three biggest surprises in the last year were people being confident you can electrify long-haul trucks and airplanes, for short-haul airplanes, ammonia for storage, and hydrogen production put into natural gas pipelines. That's something that we haven't even started talking about in the United States, that clearly is in conversation here. And all this can be created with renewable energy. So all that power we talked about spilling yesterday, you just divert it directly to creating ammonia or creating hydrogen.
Which starts to decarbonise the gas route.
Exactly.
And maybe I add to that, Australia is it's an energy and resource exporter, and it has a fantastic in terms of solar and wind irradiation. So one of the business models, I think, in the future, and Arena's working on that if I'm not mistaken, is how do you turn that resource base here into something that you can export, or maybe in the future attract energy-intensive industries, because you have such an amazing solar resource here that you might have aluminium smelting here. You know what is being done in Norway with hydropower in a very cheap fashion. I think models like these will I think surprise us all and create jobs and, you know, an export areas where you can deploy renewables in a big way.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, once, you know, essentially PV gets to a zero cost almost energy, you know, what does that mean? You're flush with energy. Okay, what do you think? Anyone out there got a question? I'm happy to take a comment. There's a question over here. Let's start over here. Actually, just there. Sorry, first person there.
Thanks very much. Simon Salter from K&L Gates. We're an international law firm with quite a strong renewables practice, particularly in the States. One of the things that I've noticed over the last couple of days, which I think has been an excellent conference, is that there's been very little discussion at all about the role of government policy and how that impacts on the miners' plans for the future. I mean, we've seen over the last 5 years in Australia sort of chaos at every level. I mean, how safe do you guys feel that those in charge of our policy and energy direction really understand the issues, and should they just get out of the way and let the market solve the problems?
Nathan, start with you. Any comments?
Well, I think that both the market and the government have significant roles to play. I think that the national electricity market has failed industry for a number of years now, and the response to the Finkel review was fairly disappointing from our perspective.
Front page of the Fin review this morning had an article about that.
And it was immediately attacked. We thought that, you know, many of the recommendations were very sensible, more or less consensus on the path forward and some some policies to last that people can make decisions around. And this, the turmoil that we saw in the national electricity market has certainly led, to the project that I'm involved with, which is looking at how we procure power and where we have islanded systems, where maybe we should have more islanded than we have had in the past. But also then looking very deeply at how the national electricity market will evolve going forward. So we're currently working on scenarios for that market, looking at how power prices will evolve under different scenarios out to 2050. And in the context of that, then considering the opportunities that renewables and other technologies offer to us.
Yeah, maybe I'll pick up on that. And I think it has been touched upon. There's a very big legislative vacuum, I think, post-2020. Like no one, forecasts of LGC until 2020 are there, but no one really knows what's happening after that. What is the potential target? That makes it very difficult for long-term investments, which energy definitely is, and I think mining as well. So I think there's a big gap to fill. Maybe just on an anecdotal experience on our Sandfire project, I've done a lot of hundreds of megawatts of wind and solar projects, project financing. The amount of legal and let's say requirements we had for this project topped all of the 4,300 megawatts that we've done elsewhere on the planet. So we had all the big law firms and everything in there. We got it all done, and but I think that is something where there is definitely room for improvement, room for efficiencies to grow. Yeah.
Miners, comment on policy. I know it's often fraught with danger, but
Yeah, won't comment too much, but the one that's probably going to cause us the most headaches in the short term is the East Coast gas issues. We'll be going out to market to get some gas contracts because we are grid connected up there near Mount Isa. I'm not overly looking forward to going out there and seeing what we can access at the moment because it's just incredibly tight, and it's quite surprising when anyone tries to say otherwise in the newspaper. You take it with a grain of salt and understand that they're talking their own book because it's real.